So do you need me to hold the microphone, or is this okay?
You're okay.
Yeah, or it's not like, it's more for the, you can hold it, all right, great. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody. Appreciate y'all turning out tonight. My name is David Bialy. I supervise the APR program for the Department of Ag Resources. We are recording, where we're live streaming on Facebook to all our 6,000 plus followers at MDAR, and we are getting recording from the local cable as well. So this is just for the microphones for the sound. We do have a number of partners here with us besides MDAR that came out that if you haven't talked to already, I just want to bring your attention to the folks who's here. So we have CMAP, and I'm just going to let them all introduce themselves and tell you what they do. So I'm going to start over here.
Hi everyone, I'm Shannon from CMAP, the Southeastern Massachusetts Agricultural Partnership. We are the buy local organization for Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth counties. So we offer technical assistance to farmers and fishers, everything from business planning to building websites to applying for grants and loans. And we also do promotion of local food to consumers through our local food guide and a number of other ways.
Hello everybody, Scott McFadden from Wildlands Trust in Plymouth. We're a regional land trust. We cover 52 communities. And despite our name, Wildlands, we're not only concerned with wildlands preservation, we're also concerned with farmland preservation. We work at different farmlands projects at all different scales. Most recently, we worked on the Pony project here in Middleborough that some of you are familiar with. And we have a farmer on our board who's sitting in the audience who has been a great resource for us in learning about what farmers do and how to put farmland projects together. Thank you.
Just passing the mic over there.
Hi everybody, my name is Dee Levanti. I'm with Land for Good, and I'm the Southeastern Mass Field Agent with Land for Good. And what we do is we work with farmers on land tenure and secure land tenure. So we help with leasing, we help with succession planning or transfer planning, and we can help navigate decisions like putting your land into APR, making your land available for the next generation. We do workshops, and we also do research and have a national presence in the area of farmland. And I'm also a farmer, and I lease APR land. So, yay, APR, happy to be here.
Thank you. Thanks. I just want to introduce Jay Rosa back there. If you haven't met Jay already, he's one of our field planners who covers essentially the southern swath of Massachusetts from the Cape and all the way west to the Berks. So if you or your friends have farmland in that area, he'd be the contact for APR. And we also have other folks who cover the rest of the state, and their contact info might be floating around here. If not, it's certainly on our website. So with that, we can get into it. Really the purpose tonight is to sort of give a broad overview of the APR program for people who might be considering enrolling in the program. So I can do a little bit of a presentation, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. All right, yep. So the APR program has been around. It was established in the late 1970s. We protected our first farm in the early 80s. So we've been doing this for over 40 years at this point. The purpose of the program is really a couple of things. It's one, to protect permanently farmland, to make sure that we have land that's available for commercial agricultural production. And there's also an affordability component to it, which we implemented in the early 90s, where the resale of APR land for any APRs that were put into place since the early 90s is limited to the agricultural value. And it also is intended to be sold to a farmer or to a nonprofit organization that leases farmland to farmers. So the idea there is to try to keep farmland accessible to existing farmers and aspiring farmers. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So interesting that the APR program has been seen as a solution to a lot of challenges that we're still facing, perhaps even more so in these days, as of this year, Massachusetts is ranked 3rd in the nation in terms of the percentage of farmland that we're projected to lose by 2040. Our land prices, as I'm sure many of you know, are very high. We have the 3rd highest, the 3rd most expensive farmland values in the country. That's based off of the 2022 ag census that just came out. And farmers, a lot of them face a lot of pressure to sell, whether it's an economic challenge or they just don't have a successor. They're not sure what to do with the farmland if they're transitioning out of farmer. A lot of times it might wind up going to development. So the good news, I mentioned we've been doing this for over 40 years. We have protected almost 1,000 farms. We'll probably hit that number sometime in the next year and a half or so. And that's a little over 75,000 acres at this point. And you can see on the map here, all those little green dots, each one of those represents one of those nearly 1,000 APRs that we've protected. You can see the concentration in the Connecticut River Valley. I'd love to see a lot more of those green dots on the eastern part of the state, but we do have some pretty good amounts in that area as well. So what is an APR? APR is short for Agricultural Preservation Restriction. It's a permanent deed restriction, and it's intended to protect the farmland for commercial agricultural use. It runs with the land in perpetuity. So what that means is, once the APR is in place, the restrictions on the property remain for each successor landowner. Okay, so it's just like your property deed. It gets recorded at the registry of deeds, it's in the chain of title, and all the following landowners have to abide by that restriction. We do this by, sure.
I have a question.
Okay.
Who defines commercial?
So it's a great question. So who defines commercial agriculture? So our program, the law that established our program defines it as what is acceptable under Chapter 61A. So specifically sections 1 and 2. So Chapter 61A talks about agriculture, which is, to summarize or paraphrase, generally the raising and selling of animals. That's how it's defined. Or horticulture, which is essentially plants.
Mm-hmm.
61A's definition is that there's a certain economic gross income benchmark in 61A. It's pretty low. It's like $500 for the first 5 acres, I want to say.
Right.
And like $1 pennies on the dollar on top of that. So that's what the law states for our program.
Okay.
So, you know, how do we achieve acquiring APRs? People can donate essentially an APR to us. There's value to that. There's economic value, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we generally do is we make a payment, a cash payment to landowners. Essentially, the way to most easily understand it is you're essentially extinguishing the development rights of your property. Okay, so if you could put 10 houses on your land, instead of doing that, we're gonna pay you for the fair market value of that, and you're extinguishing that right so that those houses won't be developed in the future. It's completely voluntary, right? So we'll get the property appraised by an independent appraiser. We pay for the appraisal. We can share that with you, and if you like the offer from us that's based on the appraisal, great, you can decide to enroll. If not, no harm, no foul. You can walk away, no obligation. So what are some of the requirements of the APR? We talked about commercial agriculture, so there's a requirement to keep it in commercial agriculture. One of the biggest restrictions that most people think about, and this is our current situation, is that we don't include residential dwellings in the APR. If there's an existing dwelling, we carve it out, essentially. And if you want to retain land for future dwellings, we can carve that out as well. We do allow for labor housing to be constructed on APRs. as well as other agricultural structures and improvements. Dwellings is a really big topic these days. A lot of farmers are saying they need to live on the property in order to farm it. And housing is a big topic with this current administration as well. So we're taking a look at dwellings and whether or not we might wanna start including them in APRs going forward. So that might be an option in the future, but right now, we don't allow it at this point in time. So generally what an APR does is it restricts the property from any kind of commercial or industrial use except for agriculture or horticulture. But there is a caveat. We recognize that in Massachusetts in particular, having flexibility to make income off your land through other activities besides commercial agriculture can be a benefit to the farmer, and sometimes is really critical for their viability. So we have this thing called a special permit, and that's through law. Every APR owner has this ability to have a special permit for commercial activities that are non-agricultural in nature. One of the biggest examples people often throw out there is to host weddings, for example. So you could rent out the land and your barns to host a wedding if you have a special permit, and that allows you to generate additional income that's not agricultural, but it's compatible with the use of the land. It's not going to be detrimental to the resource. The other big restriction, as I mentioned earlier, is the resale value. So what we do is we have what's called an option to purchase at agricultural value. Okay, so that means if you enroll in our program, if and when you ever decide to sell the property, it gives us the first opportunity to buy it, right? That's number one. Number two, it limits the resale value to the agricultural value of the market at that time, okay? And number three, as I mentioned earlier, the sale has to go to a farmer or a land trust, or I should say a nonprofit organization that leases land to farmers. If you don't meet those three criteria, we can't waive our option to purchase. Normally what happens is someone already has a buyer lined up that they want to sell it to, and they just ask us to waive our option to purchase. And we do that most of the time. But by having this right, or this option to purchase, it helps us ensure affordable access to farmland for farmers.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
So at that point, you're becoming my partner.
In many ways.
Right, you are gonna be telling me who I can and cannot. No, don't shake your head, because that is what you said. It might not necessarily be about highest value. It could turn around and become a case that you're gonna say, no, we're not gonna sell it to highest value, we're gonna sell it for a lower price to somebody you deem to be a better farmer.
Generally, yeah, there's a lot of accuracy in there. So there's regulations that have been established that guide us on how we make those decisions. So it's not just an arbitrary decision. But yes, if we get a proposal to sell it to someone who we deem by the regulatory definition is not a farmer, that the sale price is above what's established as agricultural value, and we establish that through two methods. The landowner has the option of either getting an appraisal to determine what that is, or there's a free method through an inflation calculation. So what I always tell people is do the free method and see if you like the number. If you don't, maybe you want to go get an appraisal, right? So those are two things. And then the third is, do they have a viable business plan? And we have metrics that are on our website on how we determine whether or not that's the case. But yeah, I mean, sure, that's accurate.
It has backfired in the past.
I understand, yes,
It,
sir,
it
I've
has
heard-
backfired, and I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the person that sells the deed restriction. And then their partner tells them, nope, can't sell it to this guy, gotta sell it to them. And you might take a considerable bit less because of the decision made by the department.
Potentially, so.
No, it's happened. It's not a potential. It has happened in the state of Massachusetts. You know,
I would
I'm
challenge
just-
that, I would challenge that
I won't.
understanding.
I'll give you the name and address.
Yeah, please do.
You know?
So the way it works by regulation
Mhm.
is, if we find that they're not a farmer, they don't have a viable business plan, or the price is not at ag value, we're not able to give a waiver for that, right?
Mhm.
So that leaves us with two choices. Generally, it's, we have to exercise our right to purchase. If that happens, what we do is we put out a request for proposals to say, we're seeking essentially a better business plan for someone who's a farmer, and it's gotta be at agricultural value, right?
Mhm.
If we don't get any applications, or we get applications that are equal on par to the buyer that you have lined up,
Mhm.
the landowner gets to make the decision on who they sell that land to.
Okay.
Right? So, you know, there might be disagreements on what agricultural value is, but that's why we provide the option of an independent appraiser to allow a licensed professional to determine what the market deems that price is.
Mhm.
But if there were two farmers that were equally qualified, and the price was $500,000 for the farm, and one guy says, I'll pay $600,000. Can you guys come in and say, he's not as qualified as the other guy, so you have to sell it to him for $500,000?
If they're equally qualified, and by qualified, you can look to the regulatory definition. A farmer is defined as currently as someone who has owned or operated a farm business for 2 or more years. So if they meet that threshold, they're equal. Or someone who's worked full-time on a farm, for 2 or more years. Okay? The other thing to understand about that is, there is wiggle room on the agricultural value. So the regulations allow the sale price to be as much as 19% above whatever your appraisal says, or the inflation calculation says. It's sort of an acknowledgement that appraisals aren't perfect, right? It's an assessment of what the market is. If you wanna sell it for 20% above ag value or more, you have the opportunity to justify why, right? So you might have a buyer who's willing to pay a little bit more than somebody else because the land's right next door to their operation, for example, right? That might be worth it for them to do that. So there's wiggle room for that, for the applicant to say, this is why it makes sense and meets the regulations as they are.
And when is the agricultural value established, when the farmer's gonna sell his land? I guess that's what.
Yeah, so under it depends, because there's 2 different methods. So when we acquire an APR, I mentioned earlier, we do an appraisal to determine what the value of the APR is, the purchase price. It's at that time, that appraisal establishes what the ag value is at that point in time. Right, so let's say in 1980, you enrolled in the APR program and the ag value was $100,000, just for
Sure.
talk. Now you're selling the property in 2024. What you do is you use that initial baseline $100,000 value, and you apply the inflation calculation to say, well, if it was worth $100,000 in 1980, what's it worth in 2024? That's method number 1.
That's how they do it.
That's one option. That's your choice as landowners. Do I wanna choose this?
Wow.
Sometimes it works better, sometimes it's not better, because inflation doesn't always track market value. So the other option is to get an appraisal. So the appraisal is done when you wanna sell it. So if you're selling it in 2024, you can choose to go get an appraisal. That usually takes 30 to 90 days maybe. And it looks at the market value as of today. Yep. So you can compare the numbers and decide which one works better for you, essentially.
Okay,
Good questions. So let's say you're still interested. How do I know if I'm even eligible for this program? There's 3 kind of basic parameters to know if you're eligible. Do you have 5 acres or more of contiguous land? It can be bisected by a public road. So if you have 2.5 acres on this side of the road and 2.5 acres on this side of the road, that still counts. That's number 1. In addition to that, you also have to have the property been devoted to agriculture for the past 2 tax years, okay? And this is all through regulation and law. The third, so on top of that, we talked about that commercial benchmark for gross sales earlier, right? $500 for the first 5 acres, $5 after that, or 50 cents, depending on what kind of land it is. If you meet those 3 benchmarks, you're eligible for consideration. Okay, so most people meet them. We are a competitive program. We only get so much money every year to purchase APRs. So, you know, even if you're eligible, it doesn't guarantee that you're gonna be able to get funding from us that year, but at least you're eligible for consideration.
Do you have a backlog?
Not currently. I'd love to have a backlog.
There has been in the past,
There has been.
correct?
That's right, absolutely. And we'll talk about why now is a good time to consider the program in a little bit. So how does it work? Let's say I'm interested in enrolling in the program. I put in my application. I mentioned earlier, we go pay for an independent appraiser to determine what the value is. We make you an offer. If you like the offer, great. We'll move forward with sort of standard real estate transaction due diligence. We do a title examination to make sure you got clear title. And we'll do a boundary survey if there isn't one on record already. You can reject the offer if you don't like it or it's just not the right time for you, and you can walk away. Assuming you accept the offer and we move forward, then we go to closing, we record the document at the Registry of Deeds, and you get your paycheck. That's a very boiled down version of the process. How long does it take? So, once you let's say you're interested, you put in an application, it can take up to 6 months for you to get an offer from us once you apply. Why does it take that long? We accept applications at any time. We accept it on a rolling basis. But what we do is we rank all the applications that we have on a quarterly basis, right? So if you apply January 1st, you might have to wait until end of March for our ranking. So there's a couple of months potentially just depending on when you apply. In addition to that, I mentioned we do the appraisal. We have to put the appraisal out to bid to make sure we're spending tax dollars wisely and fairly. The appraiser needs time to do it, and so that can take a few more months as well. So it can take up to as many as 6 months to get the offer from us.
Can you explain the ranking?
I can, Jay might help me out. So we rank we have a score sheet that we give points for certain attributes of the application. A lot of it's based on the physical attributes of the land itself. So for example, does it have prime agricultural soils or soils of statewide importance, or most recently, soils of local importance? Until very recently, we didn't have what's called soils of local importance in Massachusetts. But the NRCS, working with American Farmland Trust, has been going across the state, educating communities about this opportunity for them to voluntarily adopt locally important soils for their community. I think we've got 82, 83 towns that have done this to date, and they're still working through that to try to cover the whole state. So soils.
Has any of that work been done in Plymouth County?
I don't know, do you have local important soils in Plymouth?
Whitman is a very recent one, working with Orange,
Middleborough is
Middleborough?
in preparation.
Great.
Swansea as well.
So soils is a big ranking factor, that's a pretty big one. We look at viability, you know, are you proximate to other farms or markets? We look at proximity to other conserved farmlands and conserved lands. I think we've recently, although it may not be officially adopted yet, we've looked at adding, you know, do you have a business plan? Do you have a succession plan? What else am I missing there, Jay?
You mentioned location. We do look at location in the wider context of the agricultural climate in that area.
Yep. So our ranking sheet, if it's not on our website, it will be in the near future. We're working on a website revision right now, but we could certainly send you a copy. So we give you an offer within the first 6 months of your application. Let's assume you accept the offer. From that point on to the closing table, it can take 12 months plus or minus. Why does it take that long? We do the boundary survey, the title research, and some other reports, but it's also, we have to go find the rest of the funding. So right now our program provides somewhere between 40 and 45% of the purchase price, and we work very closely with NRCS through their ASAP ALE program to almost always go get 50% from them. And then there might be working with Wildlands Trust or some other local organization to come up with any of the other monies to make the landowner whole. Maybe sometimes it's the municipality if that's something that the landowner's open to as well. Yes.
Someone from the Facebook Live had a question.
Okay.
In the comments.
Yeah.
And they asked, who pays for the appraisal and the title search?
Yeah, great question. Who pays for the appraisal and the title search? MDAR does. There's no cost to the landowner.
But it is a third-party appraiser that we go out to bid.
Yes.
To hire.
Yep. Third-party independent appraisal and title examiner.
So if you make an offer to me for an APR restriction, and I decide before I commit to it, I'm gonna have my own appraisal done for the commitment, would that change your mind at all, or is the MDAR appraisal basically as far as it goes?
That's a great question. We're completely open to having landowners get their own appraisals if that's what they want to do. We would just need to make sure that they're a qualified appraiser and that they follow the standard of the industry.
Okay.
Assuming that they do that, it meets ours. So we could let you pay for it and use your appraisal if
Right.
it meets those standards.
Yep.
Absolutely. Or if we each get an appraisal and yours is different than ours, we'll have a conversation about it, examine it, maybe we'll have the appraisal reviewed by a third appraiser, or decide to go get a third appraisal and figure out what the deal is. Yeah.
Okay. What's the cap per acre right now on prime ag land?
So the question is, what's the cap per acre? So our program historically has limited how much we will buy an APR for our portion of the purchase price, how much we'll limit per acre. So in the past, it was 10,000 an acre at times. We've increased that number. So right now it's 17,000 an acre, is that right?
Yeah.
If it's a very high scoring project, it can go as high as 34,000 an acre, okay? But the key thing to remember now is that's just our portion of the purchase price. So I mentioned earlier, we pay 40 to 45% of the purchase price. It's gonna be really rare that someone comes out above the cap for that 40 to 45% of the purchase price. It might happen,
Right.
but it's gonna be pretty rare.
But that's without, yep, without NRCS's.
Right, we don't apply the cap to them, because it's not our money.
Right.
Yeah.
So on, once the APR is written, you have some partners, say Wildlands Trust, do they add, restrictions, their own to that? Or is this just kind of a generic APR that they say, oh, that's a good idea, we'll just give you the money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're working with partners like the land trust, and they're providing some money towards the deal, are there additional restrictions that come with that? It depends, probably. They might say, we don't need any additional restrictions, or they might say, you know, we'd really like to see a public access trail here, right? And that becomes a negotiation between all the parties at that point. Sometimes funding sources, depending on where it comes from, have different strings attached. I'll say that in general, most of the time, we're not asked for a lot of additional items. Our APR document is pretty boilerplate. It's kind of like take it or leave it. But there is opportunity to consider different, what we call reserve rights. So, you know, I don't know, maybe you've got a barn that collapsed and you want to rebuild the barn. You could make it abundantly clear that you've got the right to do that by tweaking the language a little bit. Right? If we do use the NRCS program for that other 50%, it's pretty boilerplate as well, kind of take it or leave it. We're not the only game in town, just wanna be clear about that, right? Wildlands Trust, you can work with them and not us, that's fine, that's okay. If you work with a partner, typically they can be a little bit more flexible on the restriction terms, but again, it becomes a negotiation between the entities, and it might depend on the funding sources. So depending on what money's being used, it might work for you, it might not.
Also, as far as how the APR is administered year in and year out, as administrations change, as different employees change, is there very much change in your boilerplate and how it's interpreted?
Good question. So would the restriction change over time due to staff or administration changes and how it's interpreted? Would that change? The contracts, I mentioned earlier, it's a 40-plus-year-old program. The contracts that we did in 1980 are light years different than the APR documents that we do today, okay? We have to honor what the wording is of that 1980 contract. It's a legal binding document, so we can't change it. We have modified what the restrictions are and what the allowed uses are over time to try to keep current with the needs of agriculture. So the 1980 document looks very different than the 2024 document, but it's not like we're gonna bait and switch it, right? It's, you have an opportunity to see what the contract is today when you're considering enrolling. We strongly advise people have an attorney and other advisors look at it for them, so everybody's eyes wide open and understands how it works and what you're deciding to do, okay? And then once it's in place, we both have to honor that contract. Yeah.
Just a quick question about your criteria. Some of it seems unintentionally discriminatory against this part of the state. I talked about this with Jay. For example, the proximity to other protected farms. We're working with John Huntz right now to help hopefully put an APR application on his Whitman farm. And there's no APRs in the vicinity, but it's a regionally significant farm.
Yeah.
So is it possible to put less weight on considerations that are seemingly geographically biased, if you will?
Yeah, so great question. You know, maybe some of our scoring might be biased towards different regions of the state, because one of the criteria being proximity to APRs, and you saw that map earlier, there were a bunch of APRs in certain parts of the state. So the scoring sheet is not a black and white yes or no. It's a tool, because no scoring mechanism is perfect, right? It's a tool to help indicate how good of a project is this. Our planners like Jay use that tool to help develop what their recommendation is. So even if it doesn't score as high as another project that might be in better proximity to other APRs, doesn't mean it's gonna be a project that we're not gonna recommend. And we don't necessarily fund based on scoring, okay? So what we do is if we have a project, an application in front of us, once we make our assessment, we have to bring it to the Agricultural Lands Preservation Committee, the ALPC. It's a governor-appointed committee. There's farmers who sit on the committee, as well as other ag-oriented organizations. There's a couple of land trusts representatives as well. I think Sheffield Land Trust is the current representative, Kathy Orlando. We make a recommendation as MDAR staff to this ALPC committee. Ultimately, it's their decision on whether or not we move forward with the project, okay? So Jay might say, hey, it doesn't score as great as this other project, but it's still a good project for all these reasons. And maybe he even points out a potential bias in our scoring, right? It's a public meeting, anyone can attend, and if you wanna try to get recognized by the chair, or who's our commissioner, to say, hey, I'd like to say something about this project, absolutely, more than welcome, right?
Okay, it's good to know.
Yeah, and we're always, like I mentioned, we're currently like looking at making revamps to our scoring. We're always trying to make sure that it's as best as it can be, it's working as well as it should, and we're required by regulation to review all of our policies and procedures at least once every 3 years to try to stay current and to keep improving the program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
What would the top ranking qualifications be?
You would, lights out, so big property, lots of great soils.
Acreage.
Yeah, acreage, open tillable land,
Yep,
great soils,
yep.
proximity to other APRs and conserved farmland.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's had business plan, succession plan, that the property is, intensively farmed versus like the bare minimum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Succession plan.
sure.
I look at some of the properties that have happened, and then the person selling the APR, everyone knows it up front. They're done. This is part of the vehicle to sell the property, so that the next potential farmer may buy it. Do you necessarily have to have that next person in
No.
line ready to buy it?
No, it's not a requirement.
Certainly makes us feel a lot more comfortable about it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a plus if you do.
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
All right, so we've gotten to the closing, 12 months offer to close. So what's the total amount of time to do this? In general, it can be 18 months to 2 years, plus or minus. We're actually doing pretty good in Massachusetts. We're somewhere in the middle compared to other states. We use the ASAVAL program. But that's, our goal is 18 months. Sometimes it takes longer, just because of the particulars of the transaction. Now's the excellent time to apply. We don't have a waiting list, so the competition is less. And there's a lot of money now and in the pipeline coming down through the federal government. So we've got $10 million to commit this calendar year, okay? That's a lot of money. Traditionally, we get about 2 to 3 million from the state each year. So we've got a lot more money right now. A lot of that's coming from the feds, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, as well as ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. A lot of those monies are coming to us for APR acquisition. IRA, NRCS is getting a ton of money from them. This year, hopefully, to be determined. Definitely next year and the year after. So the good news is there's a lot more money available than there has been in the past, and hopefully that'll continue. So financial benefits are usually what are the driving decision for a lot of people considering enrolling in the program. Land is usually one of the bigger assets that people have. So what are the financial benefits? You get the cash payment for the purchase of the APR. There are tax incentives. So some of those tax incentives are if you're not currently enrolled in 61A, which is kind of rare these days, but if you're not, by law, APRs are taxed at 61A rates. So your property tax would be reduced if you're not already enrolled. In addition to that, if you wanna donate a portion of the value of the purchase price, or accept, if you can't fully fundraise the full amount, you could choose, if you wanted to accept something less than 100% of the appraised value. The state has a tax credit program that can give you up to $75,000 back. And the federal government has a program where farmers can deduct 100% of their adjusted gross income for as many as 16 years until you use up the entire value of the gift. It's kind of like a debit card, if you want to think about it that way. Maybe those incentives are attractive, maybe they're not. Just want to make sure that you're aware that they're out there. And for some folks, you can help avoid estate taxes if that's in the cards for you as well. So that's the spiel. Happy to continue to answer questions. Solar is a big question. New ag structures is a big question for a lot of folks. What else? I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that came up in the last question. But if you have anything else, yeah, keep coming.
Solar.
Yeah.
So it's my understanding that you guys will allow solar, but it cannot exceed what the farm uses on a monthly basis, right? You can't
Almost.
right?
Almost.
Okay.
You're halfway there.
Okay.
So do we allow solar? Yes, but it's to a limited extent. And it's limited by 3 things. If we do not use the NRCS funding program, okay, you don't have to use it, so sometimes we don't. If we don't use that program, our state program allows you to generate up to 100% of your ag energy needs and an additional 100% on top of that. Okay? The other potential limitation on there is impervious surfaces. So just like a roof doesn't let rain, hit into the ground immediately, we consider solar panels impervious surfaces. By regulation, the maximum amount of impervious surfaces that we allow is 5 acres or 5% of your land, whichever is less. So depending on how much energy you produce, you might cap out at the 200% of your ag energy needs, or you might cap out at the impervious surfaces. Right? If you're putting solar panels on an existing structure, you don't need our approval. There's no limitation on that. That's if we don't work with the feds. If we do work with the NRCS program, they're a little stricter. They only allow you to generate the energy for the premises. Okay, so you can't generate excess energy off the farm. In addition to that, their impervious surfaces starts at 2%. You can seek a waiver to get it as high as RMAX, but it's a waiver process that you have to go through. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the score sheet.
Yep.
Something about using 100% of the property tillable. Does the forestry plan, does that cover that?
Good question. Does forestry count as use of tillable land? So forestry is defined as a horticultural use under Chapter 61A. So it's an allowed use. It's something that we consider, yes, eligible. I'm not sure how that would tease out in our score sheet. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Jay, but.
I mean, since we're speaking hypothetically, it probably wouldn't evaluate as high as open ag. You would obviously need a forest management plan that's approved by the state, a cut-in plan, as well. And if we're working with a federal funding source, typically it is, limited to 1/3 open ag, 2/3 forest land. So those are the types of criteria we would be considering.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little more about housing on the current, APRs?
sure.
So labor housing, like you can add labor housing, but you can't add housing for farm owners?
Yeah, so talk more about housing. Do we allow labor housing, but currently the situation is we don't allow housing for owners. So the thing to keep in mind, and the message that I try to always remind people of is, because we're a 40-plus-year-old program, and because we have contracts from 1980 that we have to honor versus the different language of today, there's a portfolio, a handful of APRs that have houses on them and or allow the landowners to ask for permission to build houses on them, right? We stopped doing that in the early 90s. So there's a bunch of APRs that were done before then that allow them to either do it or to ask for permission. Since the 90s, we haven't allowed it, and we haven't included existing houses in the restriction. Why? Because we started to see properties being sold off for estate properties versus farms. We're looking at that again now because of all the discussion about cost of living and affordable housing for farmers, and so it's something that we're gonna be looking at really closely. But currently still, the approach is we don't include existing houses for owners, and we don't allow for new houses for owners to be built. For all the APRs throughout history of the program, we do allow for labor housing to be constructed with advanced permission. Generally, we're looking for trying to site the structure so that it's not impacting good ag soils, if that's possible, right? And that, demonstrating that there's a need for it and that they're employees.
So what you're really, one of the things that comes into my mind is that when you say you're not allowing housing for the owners, but that could be done when you do the restriction. You could set aside a piece of property and say that's not in the restriction, and you have nothing to say about it.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So when you say that you would cut out a housing lot out of the restriction, so that gives you dwelling number 1. If you think you need dwelling number 2 and 3 down the road, someone has the opportunity to hold it out.
Yeah, the person who's making the decision to enroll in the program, or the people, the family, whatever, will work with our planners to say, hey, these are my goals and concerns, and if part of that includes, like, I wanna keep out 1, 2, 3 houses, fair enough, okay? We'll work with you to figure out where that would be, if that's still a project that we can help you with, right? And we do it fairly frequently.
Okay. But that's only a one-shot deal.
One shot currently.
You're right,
Yeah,
it's a
that's right.
one-shot deal,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And we would wanna keep in mind, obviously, local zoning compliance as well for buildable.
Oh, yeah.
lots of
Yeah,
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 oh, yeah, you have to,
yeah,
has to pass.
right.
Yep.
Yeah.
What else? Fire away, you got me for another 50 minutes if you want.
Use that term, when they changed the rules about a state, going for a state rather than a farm,
Yes,
if I heard it correctly. But philosophically, it's still open.
correct.
Just because some rich guy knows it might be resentful, but it's still open.
It's still open, but there also has to be the maintenance of commercial farming, And I'm not gonna, plenty of rich people are great farmers, nothing against them. Historically, what we've seen is it becomes an affordability challenge, if it becomes an estate property, right, with the houses. Because there's no restriction really on a house, and because of our current housing prices being so high in Massachusetts, it really narrows the field of who can afford that property, right? So that was a decision back in the 90s that was made to say, you know what, in order to try to help keep these properties affordable to the most amount of farmers and to avoid challenges of people who aren't really wanting to own the property to commercially farm, they decided to start keeping the houses out. We're looking at it again, times change, and so we need to change as well, but that's what the current status is.
So, how do you make it attractive for that young, broke, hardworking, entrepreneurial person to get started and not swamp themselves with a mortgage on that real estate, even at 10 grand an acre?
Right.
How can you, because now what you're telling me is you want farmers to own the property. So, someone sells a deed restriction. They need to convey it to someone else for whatever reason in the world, and you want it to be farmed by a farmer. How do you get these people? Where do you find them?
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Because guess what?
Yeah.
They can drive to Boston every day and make a lot more money and have weekends off. And get their health care paid for, and get money put into your retirement. All of these things.
Yeah.
So explain to me, in the view of the committee running APR presently, okay, the staff, the people that have to do the hard thinking about how do we shape this program. Because my knowledge goes all the way back to Fred Winter. I've been following this program for a long time. How do we get those people on the farm? Because the way I look at it, my wife's family have been doing this since 1946. There is so much potential in this part of the state, and the big reason is the population. They want us here. COVID woke them up. When they walked into all these grocery stores, and guess what? I couldn't find milk, I couldn't find meat, I couldn't find eggs, I couldn't find bread. Great. We can all live in the Connecticut River Valley, but guess where the people, the consumers live? They live here. How are we gonna get people on the property?
Yeah,
That's to me is a giant question.
it is a giant question, and I can tell you, I don't have 100% of the answers right now, but I can tell you what we're doing to try to answer those questions. So starting with my program, the APR program, that's where the option to purchase at ag value comes in,
Yep.
right? It limits the resale to ag value. That's still a challenge.
Yeah, that's
Ag
my
value is
point.
still way high.
That's hard for a person that's gonna live within the constraints
Yes.
of an agricultural system.
Yes, no question,
Yeah.
especially in this region of the state, the ag values, right, and the housing values. That's the best tool that we've come up with so far for this program. We're looking at housing, maybe we can have some affordability restrictions on the housing. Outside of the APR program, what the department is doing, we also have a land licensing program where the state owns some land, usually an old state hospital land that was associated, that has ag land. And we have what we call care and control of those properties. In other words, it's our responsibility to sort of take care of them, So what we do is we have this program where we license out or lease out essentially these lands to farmers. So there's an option for people who are seeking farmland, but maybe don't have the capital to own it, right? We're really looking to expand that program. There's a bill moving through the legislature right now. It'll give us, if it passes, authority to own land, so that we can buy it and keep it. If we get that, then that'll help us go get more farmland and make it accessible through these licenses at much reduced cost. That's another strategy.
Yep.
The third strategy is we just released a statewide farmland action plan. So this was a multi-year process where we reached out to a lot of farmers and stakeholders to figure out all things farm, including land access and viability. So that just came out. It has literally hundreds of recommendations on how to address that issue and many more. We have just hired a full-time staff person, Catherine Otto, to help implement that action plan. She just started a few weeks ago. So we've got a plan for the state, we've got some staff to help implement it, and then other organizations are also gonna be partnering with us to help implement that plan. So we don't have the perfect answer yet, but we're working on it.
I'll stop asking questions.
No, go ahead.
Can other, you just mentioned something about the department owning land. Can other entities own farmland, enter into a contract with you and NRCS and Wildlands and everybody else, and then become the vehicle to help start people out?
That was
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah, can other
I stole it from you. Sorry.
Great minds think alike. Can other entities own APR land?
Yeah, and they can, and I'm thinking back to the trustees of reservations and Wildlands Trust and, there's many organizations across the state.
Right.
Can they also become part of the vehicle?
Absolutely. So you mentioned trustees, they own APR land, they make accessible to their programs. There's other land trusts, municipalities.
Because the licensed land, we have it right here in Liquor.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
a stone's throw from that parcel.
Right,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, so, yes, other entities, qualified conservation entities, as the IRS
Okay.
calls them,
Okay.
can own land, and that's our regulations. I mentioned earlier, if you're selling APR land, it can go to a nonprofit whose purposes are to lease that land to farmers. So that's there. And then there's the regular individual mission of organizations like Wildland Trust that are interested in farmland conservation and doing their own work on that. So they, as individual organizations, can choose how they wanna try to help that issue as well. And that's what we're really looking forward to through this farmland action plan, is to bring everybody together, in a coordinated fashion to implement statewide, initiatives, but also enable those entities to do what their own private mission might be as well.
I want to speak to that a little bit too. At Land for Good, we work with farmers on succession, creating succession plans and sometimes finding successors. And so two things I would mention is that we maintain a New England-wide website for farm seekers and farming owners. So if you are looking for a match for your property to help take over some of the farming, you can post on there. And, there are way more seekers than, farmland postings. So there are a lot of people on there who are looking for farming opportunities. And also that, I think we're seeing it more now where people are getting creative in how they're transferring property. So there are mechanisms such as lease to own or, creating a trust where the new farmer buys into the trust gradually over time. And I think we are seeing more of that now too, so there are some mechanisms to really support beginning farmers or younger farmers in owning property as well as having, leasing opportunities.
Thank you for all of those questions. There's a question from Facebook. Do you list APR land that is for sale, and do you follow up on the sale of a farm to make sure the farm is being used for agriculture and not a hobby space?
Great questions. Currently, the department does not keep a running list of APRs that are for sale on our website. We've talked about it, so it's an idea that is being kicked around. The second question, do we follow up after the APRs have been sold to make sure they're not breaking the rules, right?
Yeah.
That they're still commercially farming. We do, so every APR, if it's a federal APR, one that uses the NRCS money, we're obligated to monitor that APR every single year and give a report to NRCS every single year. So about a third of our APRs, over 300 of them, are in that category. And we do that every year and have done it every year. All the other APRs, we don't have the obligation, but it's best practice to try to do that. So we're trying our best. We could certainly use more staff to help us out, and we've recently partnered with the Mass Association of Conservation Districts to help increase our capacity to do that. And we've also added several new staff over the past few years, which has been a huge improvement. And we are actively putting in place a plan to make sure that we cycle through every property with boots on the ground every 3 to 5 years, and in between that there's a monitoring interview and or review of the most recent aerial photography to try to make sure that they're still abiding by the terms. Good questions.
Can I just have a few
Yeah,
points?
please do.
Yeah, just so, some clarification on a few items that Dave already mentioned. So he mentioned the boundary survey as part of our due diligence. That item is typically a 50-50 cost share between the Commonwealth and the landowner. The landowner has the right to pursue a boundary survey on their own if they feel that they can get a better deal. Usually that cost share, there's a cost share agreement, so you can review it and sign that agreement. And it's typically not a payment upfront by the landowner, it's just the cost that you would take out on the back end as part of the APR payment check that's given to the landowner. So that's just one clarification item. Also, the appraisals that are informing our offer. Those appraisers that we hire, they're producing 3 numbers for us. There's the fair market value, so highest and best use, most commonly residential development. The agricultural value, fair market agricultural value that Dave mentioned, and then the difference between those two is the APR value. That's what's informing our offer letter to the landowner. So I just wanted to make sure we're clear on that. Obviously, that payment that we're giving to you, the landowner is still retaining the inherent agricultural value in the land. So the thought is the combination of that development right payment of the APR value, and then if there's future sale of the land at agricultural value, that's what gets the landowner whole for the fair market value. So Dave mentioned those, but I just want to make sure we're all clear on the understanding on that. Thanks.
Yeah, good clarifications, thank you.
Thanks.
So what are if I had a sign-up sheet right now, what's keeping you from doing it? Curious.
The score sheet.
So the score sheet, don't worry about it, right? It's a competitive program, but we don't have a queue. So if you're eligible, there's a pretty good chance you're gonna be made an offer. Unless there's big concerns about, I don't know, 55-gallon drums that are glowing green at night that are on the property,
But do you do a 21E?
we do a hazardous waste assessment, all appropriate inquiry, essentially. NRCS does that for us. But if if we're not using their funding, we can do our own due diligence on
Okay.
that.
One more.
Yeah.
Okay, so this rug is my farm.
Okay.
And each one of those blocks is a portion of a building. When the development rights are sold, and this would be outside of the residential area, is that what I'm limited to for square feet for present buildings on the property, for agricultural use?
Essentially, what's the limitation on agricultural use buildings?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Great question. So
And
that-
I'm only asking this because if somebody discovers that they have a niche to produce a product, whatever it be, and it could be 100 years from now, but they need to put up a manufacturing, warehousing, storage, facilities. I just looked at what other farmers have done in certain enterprises in other parts of the country. You don't want to limit someone and say, no, sorry, you can't do that. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm coming from.
These are all good, important things to think through for your own operation and your goals in the future, right? So it's not a quick decision. We always encourage people to take the time to think it through and work with our planners. Right now, it's based on the impervious surface limitation.
Yep.
Right.
So
That's it.
basically, whatever's there existing, when you show up is what?
No, so let's say you've got buildings now,
Yep,
and you enroll in the program.
yep.
Depending on if you use the federal funds or not.
Oh, okay.
There's gonna be a percentage of impervious surfaces, right?
Yep.
And then, so if you only have 1% now,
Yep.
you have the rest of
You
it.
could go up to a
Yes, sir.
certain level, okay?
Yeah. There are certain, agricultural, what do they call them, conservation practices that NRCS, keeps a list of. And so they've got certain greenhouses that are considered conservation practices.
Mhm.
If those greenhouses are on that list, we don't consider it impervious surface.
Right.
So there's lots of,
There's room to grow.
yes, sir, yeah.
I have a question,
Yeah.
an older APR down in Rochester, I didn't realize some of the older APRs were actually subdividable.
Yeah, no, they all are almost, I think, I can't give you a perfect, answer on that, because I haven't looked at all 1,000 APRs, and we don't have a
Right.
perfect database yet. But, most APRs allow some of the older ones allow for the right to subdivide without our permission. And when I say subdivide, that means different things to different people. It doesn't mean build houses. What it means is to take, say, a 100-acre property and divide it into smaller agricultural units that can be sold separately from each other, okay? Some of the older APRs, yes, absolutely. I don't know exactly when in time, but most of our APRs, you have to get advance permission to do that. And we look at a certain set of criteria, which is on our website, basically looking at the end of the day, we wanna make sure that whatever's split apart, each one of those pieces is a viable farm on itself,
Right.
right? That's what we're interested in. But farms are getting smaller,
Yeah.
right? And so that can be an important thing for operations to, adapt to, and that's why we allow for that option.
I have one of the first APRs in Norwell, and, I purchased a landlocked parcel of 10 acres behind kinda next to my farm, but it's landlocked, you can't get to it, other than me going across my APR. And, I didn't know, I have 4 kids, 2 of my kids work at the farm. I didn't know if there would be any allowability for crossing the APR with a common driveway if they wanted to build houses on that parcel that's landlocked.
Without having your specific APR document in front of me,
Yeah,
I don't wanna speculate, one way or the other, but what we would need to do is look at what does your specific APR document say about those things,
right.
right? Most of our modern day APRs, wouldn't allow it, but since yours is older,
Right.
possibly, but we could look at it with you for sure.
Why wouldn't they allow it?
It's, generally, lots of factors, so the purpose of the restriction, in addition to the access piece, is to preserve prime agricultural soils, right? And, that generally, that's it,
That's the answer.
generally.
Yeah.
If you get a project that were to try to get rid of the muddy trails that you have to get to your fields, and get to all your different beds, say, that you're growing vegetables on, is that allowed?
Oh, yeah, so, and I'm glad you brought that up. I wanna mention, there are other financial benefits that should have been, I made the same mistake last time, I didn't correct the slide. There are some grants that are available to farmers who are only APR farmers, right? So if you're enrolled in APR, we have one grant that's called the SARA grant, SARA. It's essentially a restoration grant. If something were to happen through things out of your control, flooding, maybe one of them, or the person you bought it from, let the fields go and you need to clear them again, or a storm came and eroded your roads or changed the hydrology, we give money to make those repairs to APR farmers. You don't have to use those programs, but they're available. Typical ag maintenance is allowed, right? And the document will spell out what activities do you need prior permission for, right? So you can make sure that you understand, oh, if I'm gonna build a house, if I'm gonna excavate, subdivide, those are the big ones. Have an event that's a non-ag event, it's a commercial event like goes to the weddings. Those are the biggies that you need advance permission for.
You didn't tell everybody about the APR improvement grant also.
Exactly, thank you, that's a great segue. So the APR improvement grant is another grant that goes to just APR, lands. And it's a infrastructure / viability grant where we'll give money, for farm improvement projects. And we'll give business technical assistance for business planning as well. So that's another great carrot for the program.
I purchased a farm, that APR farm in 2009, and a year after I purchased it, I got the APR improvement grant for $100,000 to build 2 brand new upright silos. It was great,
Yeah.
$100 grand, I needed it.
Yep, that's great, I'm glad to hear that, and it's actually an undersubscribed program currently, so we're trying to encourage people to apply to that if they are current APR owners. The other program I wanna mention, and there's a bunch of great materials over on this table that talk about it, is the Farm Viability Enhancement Program. It's a potential alternative to APR in the short term. What that is it's a program where we'll give you grant money, for farm viability, so get infrastructure projects, etc. You also get business, planning assistance. And if you participate in that program, in exchange for that business planning assistance and the grant money, you give a short-term APR, in a sense, for periods of, I wanna say, either 10 or 15 years, depending on the amount of the grant. You can do that program twice, right? So you can do 10 years and 10 years, or 15 and 15, or 10 and 15, 15 and 10. For some people who aren't quite ready for APR, that might be a good stepping stone. So I just wanna make sure that that's an option, and we actually have a system in place now that we're just starting to implement this year, where after those, when you're approaching year 10 or year 15, we're gonna start to talk to you about APR as a potential next step, right? So it could be a pathway into APR, if that makes sense for you and your goals.
It's a very good program.
Yeah, it's great.
Viability.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you.
Just curious, these, funding programs have match requirements?
Match requirements, I don't.
Does the
know.
farmer have to put up X?
Nope.
No.
Oh, you guys know better than I do.
You gotta have a plan.
Does
Check
the farm
comes, you
plan
better be
works?
ready to go.
Okay,
And you have to spend the money before the end of the year, so you don't wind up paying taxes on it as ordinary income.
okay.
There might be a 10% match for the AI agriculture improvement program, but, you get, we're constantly changing our programs too, so I would just get in touch with Melissa Adams. She'd be the person to talk to. What else? Why else wouldn't you wanna just immediately enroll?
I was just gonna put another plug for Melissa Adams' program with the new succession
Yeah,
planning.
please.
I don't know the details, but they're starting a new grant program to fund succession plans for farmers. If you don't have one and wanna make one for your farm, it can cover the costs. And it's gonna be a hefty plan that's covering, I think, 50 to 75 hours over the course of the year. So, contact Melissa Adams for that.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that, cause we didn't really talk about it, I don't think. Most of our farmers in Massachusetts are, at an age where they're thinking about what comes next, right? I think about a third of our
They
farmers.
wanna be done? How about that?
Yeah, fair enough. I think it's a third of our farmers are 65 or older, and more than half are 50 or older. So in the next 10, 15 years, there's a lot of farmland that might transition out of the hands of our farmers. You couple that with the prices of land, the prices of housing, solar pressure, development pressure, economic pressure on farmers, that's a recipe for farmland to disappear real quick. And that's why we're here, really trying to encourage people to consider what the next steps are, make sure that they have informed decisions that they can make. We're trying to double the pace at a minimum of farmland conservation. I'd like to increase it by 17-fold, quite frankly, to meet some of the goals in Massachusetts. So we're gonna continue to try to make improvements and continue to do these outreach efforts. We're here at any time. Whenever you're ready, you wanna come talk to us, I would encourage people to start talking to us early. And even when it's just a twinkle in your eye of thinking about APR, start talking to us so we can help you think through a really important decision. And set you up, hopefully, on a timeline that works, right? Because what I hate to see is people that come to us and say, I need this done by next month. Too late.
So really, you need 2-3 years to get it done.
On average, 2 to 3 years on average, yeah. It all just depends. Sometimes you can move a lot faster, sometimes hopefully not slower, but
Is there any requirement for the town to be involved?
there's no requirement the town be involved. Oftentimes I mentioned, if the landowner is willing, we can seek funding from the town, right? If that is the case, then the ALPC has a determination of, are they contributing significantly enough to make them what we call a co-holder of the restriction, which gives them some approval rights over some of those activities. But that's a conversation we have with you, right?
And one more thing. I grew up on a dairy farm and it's all condos now. And, my father and his 2 brothers, it was a big family fight when my grandparents died. I believe strongly that APR can kill a value of a farm so that no one's fighting over which developer is gonna put a subdivision in. And, that's one of the reasons I really like it, is because there's nothing to fight about. We're gonna sell it to a farmer and it's over. And, you know, I've lived through it, and, we have a condominium complex of 80 units on our dairy farm, and, I bought another dairy farm that was protected, and my dad, when our land was developed, he told me, if you're ever gonna farm around here, John, you better go see Mr. Loring up the street that protected his land. The same year, Mr. Loring protected his land and got $257,000 for his development rights from the state. My family got $650,000 for their land, and now it's all condominiums. So, you choose.
Right.
The money doesn't seem like a lot when you see the bulldozers coming.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is give, alternative options, that meet the financial need and hopefully make financial sense as well. All right, should we wrap it up? I appreciate y'all coming out. Please eat more food. Take some with you. Talk to our service providers here. Don't be strangers. Come talk to us if you want to. All right, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.